Every so often, you probably still run into some relic of the COVID era. Something to remind you that 2 weeks to slow the spread, at least in ways, persisted through years of nonsense, like a restaurant still doing drive-through only, or maybe a place that still has those plastic barriers up, or some politicians still telling you to get the vaccine.
Reminding everyone it's time to get that COVID shot. I know a lot of us want to forget about COVID, but we all know somebody who's contracted it and not feeling good these days, so here's how we prevent it.
She is an actual drug addict. Come on, just one more hit. Just one more hit. Notice how take the shot once and go back to normal somehow became take the shot forever, actually, even though you're still forever vulnerable when you do. And of course, you will still see people walking around or, God forbid, even driving around alone with a mask on. But how about this one? A guy still wearing a mask headed to his trial for scamming millions of dollars in a COVID relief fraud scheme. Well, how thoughtful of him to keep his community safe while he steals bags of cash from them. But I guess that was the irony of the era. Wearing a mask became a good guy thing instead of what a criminal would do. But in many ways, the biggest legacy of this massive, norm-shattering effort to protect ourselves from this danger is just how badly we got ripped off for it, both in inflation that still persists today and in money outright stolen from the Fed's Scrooge McDuck pool of printed coins that was just way too big ever to be vetted in the first place. The only protection for that pile of cash was just the honesty of the person taking the scoop, and with so many lacking that basic personal virtue, the scams, like the money itself, were just too many to count. Nobody really knows exactly how much money was lost to fraud and waste. The AP estimates at least 10%, or $400 billion of the total $4 trillion in COVID relief spending. But that's just what we know about. But hey, at least now the biggest scam has been brought to justice, which is something, but it's kind of like catching the guy who looted the most in the aftermath of the hurricane. It's better than him getting away with it, sure, but it doesn't really do much, and all that hurricane damage still remains to be fixed. Plus, this is a hurricane that we chose ourselves, so catching one hurricane looter is a lot less important than making a plan not to have the hurricane opportunity happen again. Anyway, this masked guy at the federal courthouse is Salim Saeed, a Minneapolis restaurant owner and co-defendant with Amy Bach, the director of the Minneapolis-based nonprofit Feeding Our Future. Together, they are now convicted of leading the country's biggest COVID relief scam, or the biggest one we know about so far, defrauding all of us through the federal government of more than $250 million. Because Feeding Our Future was really feeding our personal bank accounts, telling the government they were providing meal services for low-income children for whom they actually were not. Amy Bach started the business in 2018, and as seems common with certain nonprofits applying for federal grants these days, she almost immediately received money on a scale far beyond what the business had ever generated itself. In 2019, Amy Bach and Feeding Our Future received $3 million from the federal government to provide these meal services. And then in 2021 COVID times, the feds gave her some 67 times that amount. Nearly $200 million. Sounds a lot like the alleged gold bar scheme getting busted up at the EPA. Oh, wow, your progressive environmental nonprofit has no experience and raised only $100 on its own? Well, here's a $2 billion check to help low-income houses get energy-efficient appliances or something. I guess the good news is these poor Somalis in Minneapolis can put their imaginary meals in their imaginary fridges, because the people who were supposed to provide these critical services for the needy just stole the money instead. But Amy Bach is now convicted of working with dozens of co-conspirators to falsify documents to create the impression that they were feeding these needy kids. She received the federal money and she contracted with local restaurants and food providers for services that were never actually provided, at least on the scale claimed. And the scam wasn't even particularly well hidden. Prosecutors say the documentation supposedly showing the names of the kids they were feeding was just generated by listofrandomnames.com. And since the fraud got busted, the operators of that website say they're making some improvements. Stand by. So maybe the generated names will be a little more convincing next time. Bach testified in her own defense at trial earlier this month, and she blamed her employees and she claimed she didn't know, but the evidence shows otherwise. Bach signed stacks of multi-million-dollar checks herself routinely, without sufficient effort to verify the accuracy of the claims as required by law. She cut these checks to some 300 meal distribution sites that were not actually distributing meals, at least in the numbers claimed. And you would think if you're routinely handing over 7-figure checks, you might go look at least one of these places at some point in time to see the operation in action. So even if it was just being naive or too relaxed to start, it was not just that overall. Because as demonstrated at trial, she ignored the concerns of those in the organization who became aware of the fraud. She lied to investigators to perpetuate the fraud. And of course, she bragged on social media that she knows how to make money. And I guess she did. At least for a little while. Prosecutors say that for her multi-year scheme of scooping low-oversight federal cash, she reveled in the adoration of the East African community she worked with. In other words, she not only became the progressive white lady diversity queen dream meme, she actually got paid to do it too. Amy Bach oversaw the fraud of funneling hundreds of millions of dollars to her Somali superfans, and she personally collected $1.9 million for the effort too. But hey, she wasn't greedy about it. She paid her Somalis even better than she paid herself. They bought luxury cars, they bought fancy homes. In fact, they had so much cash that they actually tried to use it to scam their way out of the prosecution once the fraud got uncovered. This is the second trial for the fraud, and there are so many people involved that there are still more to come. But during the first trial, one of the jurors got a surprise late-night delivery of bags of $120,000 in cash with a promise from the black-clad delivery woman to bring more if she would vote to acquit. And one of the most enriched Somalis is this masked guy Saeed, who was just on trial and is now convicted with Amy Bach. He owned Safari Restaurant in Minneapolis. The restaurant received $16 million, and Saeed personally collected some $5.9 million, all in checks signed by Bach. He bought cars, 2 investment properties, and $1 million house with an indoor basketball court. I assume he had the culturally traditional rusty AK to convince the real estate agent on that deal. How exactly did you get that much money again, since you came here from Mogadishu for refuge from impoverishment?
Look at me, sure. Look at me, sure. I'm the captain now.
So maybe it was just, look at me, I am the homeowner now. Anyway, Saeed also testified in his own defense at trial on Monday, and he insisted this is all just a big misunderstanding. See, he did provide the services contracted, actually, on a mathematically impossible scale. He said he did, in fact, serve tens of thousands of meals a day at his restaurant with 15 tables, but it was all to go. The cars were lined up nonstop. Well, judging by their figure and their slur nickname, I'm sure Somalis are very hungry, but they can't be that hungry. There are some 50,000 of them in the Minneapolis area total, so apparently Saeed was feeding most or all of them every day. The other problem is the feds had surveillance on his restaurant, and almost nobody was visiting. But sure, the fancy car he bought with all that money must have had massive cargo capacity. Maybe he delivered these tens of thousands of meals a day himself. The case against both Bach and Saeed was convincing enough for the jury to convict them after just a few hours of deliberation on conspiracy, wire fraud, bribery, and money laundering charges. Bach's lawyer says there will be an appeal. He doesn't know how or why, but he tells reporters there is no way the jury could have fairly considered all the evidence from a 6-week trial in just a few hours. Or maybe the evidence is so overwhelming that there is no reasonable doubt for an acquittal. That's one way they could have reached a decision so quickly. There is no appeal path based on jury decision speed anyway. He should probably just try that late-night cash delivery method again at the appeals court judge's house. Given the facts, that is actually his best strategy. And maybe a realistically possible one, because even though these two are now facing serious prison time, where all of that money went is still mostly a mystery. a lot of it is probably still out there somewhere, ready to scam again. Because while it may seem reasonable to look back at the insanity of the last few years and think, yeah, sure, there was fraud, but we had to do what was necessary to fight this once-in-a-generation pandemic. And besides, those who abused are now facing justice. Is it justice, though? Because the hundreds of millions of dollars scammed in just this one case alone remain mostly just lost. So yes, these two are going to prison, but taxpayers will not be refunded. Only a quarter of the money they stole has been recovered, and the rest probably never will be. It now exists only as a fraction of what it was in repossessed Somali Cadillacs and lakefront homes. And that doesn't even factor the added costs. How much will it cost to sell off the property that was recovered? How much did it cost to investigate and prosecute this gigantic case with dozens of offenders? Surely millions of dollars more. Again, paid for by you and by me and every other taxpayer who's an honest enough sucker to actually pay it instead of scam it into their pockets. The point is, this isn't justice or restoration, really. It's just a monopoly protecting itself. It's just government saying, hey, stop stealing big piles of money on the fraudulent premise of helping people in need. That's our business. And we don't tolerate competition. One crook out-crooking the other is not a win. It's really just mob warfare. Thanks as always for listening and for supporting this channel. Always appreciate that thoughtful discussion down below, and especially over on X. That is at ML Christiansen. You're always welcome to coming out and chatting my live streams. Those live on Wednesday and Sunday nights. Looking forward to it. Come on. Hey, if you made it all the way to the end of the video, that means you probably found some value in the video. If you found some value in the video, please consider supporting my material. You can do that one time or recurring for as little as $1 a month. It not only helps me sustain, but it helps me pay the people who make my videos possible. Linked in the description for you, mattchristiansenmedia.com/support. Thanks for listening.